1890s, famous illustrator Charles Dana Gibson introduced the Gibson Girl to the world for the very first time. The Gibson Girl, the umbrella term for Gibson's illustrations of this specific new type of woman, would take American society by storm over the next decade, and went on to heavily influence not only women's fashion and beauty standards, but also the way that women saw themselves and moved through the world. Indeed, the Gibson Girl was one of the first specific aesthetics. In the last decade or so, through the internet, we've seen the rapid rise and fall of the scene girl, the hipster girl, the Tumblr girl, the soft grunge girl, the visco girl, the e-girl, and now we're experiencing the rise and rapid fall of the clean girl, whatever that means. I can't keep up anymore. Arguably, the genesis of all of them was the Gibson Girl. She was to women what J.C. Leyendeckers' Arrow Collar Man was to men, a fictional character with no real name because they weren't singular characters, but rather a way of living and looking and being. Gibson, like Leyendecker, had many models for his Gibson Girls, but a few in particular have made their mark on history in notorious ways, by being, by no fault of their own, major players in some of the most scandalous, famous murders of the early 1900s. Earlier this month, we met one of these Gibson Girl models, Evelyn Nesbit, the young girl tragically involved with two men who hated each other, resulting in the murder of one. Today, we'll briefly meet another one, silent film actress Mabel Normand, who was involved in the unsolved murder of director William Desmond Taylor. So, how exactly did these seemingly benign illustrations manage to affect greater American society in the first place? And why do they have a lot more to do with racism than we realize? Come learn with me. But first, let's hear from today's sponsor, GlassesUSA.com. I'm a very experienced glasses wearer, so I know very well just how stupid expensive glasses can be, especially if you want ones that look nice and have some personality. That's where GlassesUSA.com comes in handy. By cutting out the middleman, GlassesUSA.com offers over 10,000 prescription glasses and sunglasses, including in-house brands like Muse and Amelia E, and designer brands like Ray-Ban, Oakley, Gucci, etc., at up to 70% off retail prices. And even better is the fact that their shopping experience is super safe and reliable, with free shipping and returns and 100% money-back guarantee within 14 days. Just head to the website, and if you're not totally sure what you want, you can try taking their quiz, which only takes about a minute and suggests the right pair of glasses based on your face shape and your needs. Once you've got a pair in mind, you can even use their virtual try-on tool to get a better idea of how the frames will look on your face, which is what I did to find mine, and it was incredibly helpful. Then when you're ready to check out, you just put in your prescription if you need one, and then you can add on a number of helpful filters to your lenses, such as blue light blocking filters, and blue light glasses are ideal for protecting your eyes at home, work, or outdoors, as they also include glare protection and UV blocking. If you have to look at screens a lot for work like me, having some blue light glasses definitely helps with eye strain. I got the Muse Brookline in the tortoise and gold frames for a nifty, mid-century dad look. And then for something more classic looking, I got these Atoto Arkush gold round wire frames, which are very scholarly looking, very versatile. And to mix things up, because I live in the land of unrelenting, brutal sunshine, I got some of the Muse Lanier blue sunglasses that have a bit of a more modern angular look, which is super fun. Head on over to the links in my description to get yourself some fun new frames from GlassesUSA.com, or check out the ones that I got here. Thank you so much to GlassesUSA.com for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about the history of the Gibson Girl. Okay, we're going glasses mode. The father of the Gibson Girl, Charles Dana Gibson, was born on September 14, 1867 in Roxbury, Massachusetts, to a family with a political legacy and 5 siblings. As a child, Gibson's parents quickly realized that he had a talent for the arts, and so, after high school, he was enrolled in the Art Students League for 2 years, where he began to hone his signature pen and ink style. There, he studied with many other famous artists, and then later studied at the Académie Julian in Paris, which you may be familiar with if you watched my video on J.C. Leyendecker. The Académie Julian was the place to be for a young artist at the time, and Paris at large during this time was incredibly friendly to artists in the neighborhood, with cheap rents and thriving cafe culture and loads of galleries and salons. Young Gibson would have found it incredibly easy to become fully immersed in a rich and lively world of new art. In 1886, a cartoon drawn by Gibson appeared in Life magazine, and his career career officially began. He started out drawing cartoons in magazines like Life, Time, and Tidbits, and later the popular publications Collier's, Scribner's, and Harper's Weekly, giving readers an insight into American high society on the East Coast, as well as in London and Paris. This was a theme that his work would forever carry. It typically showed the upper classes in idealized beauty, exposing readers to a world that they had rarely been privy to before, and also giving them a new standard of aspiration. Gibson's drawings, as they gained popularity, began to accrue a power that a single illustrator had rarely had before. They were beginning to greatly influence American society at large. It's hard to say exactly when the Gibson Girl was born because she was apparently drawn from a massive number of influences, in particular the Du Maurier girl created by artist Georges Du Maurier. What we do know is technically she first appeared in 1890 in one of Gibson's drawings for Life magazine, as Gibson himself later recalled in the New York Times in an article called The Gibson Girl Analyzed by Her Originator. "I'll tell you how I got what you have called the Gibson Girl. I saw her on the streets, I saw her at the theaters, I saw her in the churches, I saw her everywhere and doing nothing. I saw her idling on Fifth Avenue and at work behind the counters of the stores. From hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, I formed my ideal. In starting out in life, each man worthwhile has his ideal of womanhood. A poet may, perhaps, create his wholly from his fancy. I guess I'm not a poet. I got mine from the crowd." While we'll talk more about some of his models later, there's no question that the main and perhaps first Gibson girl was Gibson's wife, Irene Langhorne, and her sisters. Gibson married Irene in 1895, and it seems pretty clear that she solidified for him what his beauty ideal for women was. The Langhorne sisters got their wealth from their father, Chiswell Langhorne, who had been hit hard financially by the Civil War, and had somehow quickly regained that wealth through his involvement in the tobacco and railroad industries. All this to say, Gibson had an extremely vested interest in, well, the interests of the American white and wealthy, and this does not escape the drawings he created. The Gibson Girl is the very image of romance, hashtag glow-up goals, but she also represents something deeper and much more permanent, and indeed the Gibson Girl would long outlive her father. After his death of myocarditis in 1944, Gibson's drawings were merchandised to heaven and hell and everything in between. Especially during an Edwardian revival in the 70s, the Gibson Girl would be seen everywhere, from shirts to plates to figurines to dolls, just name it. And of course, anyone who's been to Disneyland has probably paid a visit to the Gibson Girl ice cream parlor on Main Street, which is styled after a traditional Edwardian ice cream parlor and decorated with, technically, Gibson girls, though not all of them are Gibsons, because the Gibson Girl herself outgrew Charles Dana Gibson and escaped the paper confines of his work. She became a concept and a state of being all on her own and overtook the world of fashion. When we think of the Gibson Girl, we're really imagining this almost caricaturization of 1890s to Edwardian era women's fashion. Born in the 1890s, she started out with the ideal hourglass figure and sporting the fashionable Lego mutton sleeves at the time, and then transitioned to the S-curve silhouette with a pigeon breast and popped out booty with a beautiful training skirt or dress, intentionally messy yet perfect pompadoured hair, tired but alert droopy sensual eyes, a slight smirk like she's in on a joke that you aren't. The Gibson Girl is forever fashionable and elegant, and the illustrations Gibson made of her worked in tandem with the fashion industry to influence style as a whole. To get a better idea of the Gibson Girl's impact on fashion, I had a chat with the wonderful Snappy Dragon, who has some good experience sewing Gibson Girl style Edwardian ensembles. She has her own channel with some absolutely fantastic videos on fashion history that I highly recommend you check out, and I'll leave a link in the description below. V brought up some very good points that Gibson was referencing the fashion plates of the era because that's what high society women could afford, and high society women was who he was interested in portraying. It was a kind of symbiotic relationship whereby the fashions that Gibson drew were rocketed into the mainstream via mass-produced prints and therefore influenced what the middle and lower classes wanted to wear. But most importantly, the Gibson Girl represented an unattainable lifestyle that people still tried desperately to attain, similar to the Kardashian effect today. The Gibson girl was always aloof and highly desired by handsome men, and she could choose any of them, but had an air about her that she didn't care at all. V did note, though, that a core difference between the Gibson girl and the Kardashian wannabe is that, obviously, the Gibson girl is a concept that was manufactured specifically by a man, whereas the Kardashian wannabes are obviously aspiring to, effectively, the creation of other women, as internally misogynistic and centered on the male gaze as it may still be. And it is. This is pretty plain in Gibson's drawings, whether he intended it or not. The Gibson men are made to feel small by the Gibson girl most of the time. They feel almost insecure due to her power and freedom, something that, strangely, is adverse to what Gibson himself said outright that he intended. You can pause to read. That aside, though, I think that thinking of the Gibson girl as sort of the original form of today's Kardashian effect is actually incredibly helpful. The Kardashians, in a way, used their popularity and wealth to pick and choose elements of beauty to take on and off, and all that combined became this visual ideal that for more than the last decade, millions of women have paid obscene amounts of money aspiring to, because it isn't just about the look. People want to believe that with a Kardashian face and body, so follows the Kardashian life and success. If you have the face, the bobbies, and the booty of Kim K, maybe you'll feel the way she pretends like she feels too. Maybe you'll be successful just the same. Maybe you'll be beloved. Maybe your insecurities will disappear. It was exactly the same way with the Gibson girl ideal. Arguably, looking like a Gibson girl is a much more attainable and less physically threatening task. You can put on her body in the morning with the right corset and padding, like I showed earlier in this video. You can emulate her grace with a well-made outfit and the right accessories. You can steal her poise by holding yourself the same way when you're out in public, though this came with some pretty comical results, as one Indianapolis newspaper mentioned in 1895. What I have been trying to do lately, said a Chicago girl, is to model myself on the lines of Gibson's girls, and all I've learned is that pride goeth before destruction. You know how those girls look, knees in, toes out, shoulders back, arms limp, chin up, eyes on the firmament if out of doors, or the chandelier if in the house. Well, I tried it. I got downstairs by counting the steps, boarded a car and never took my eyes off the ventilators in the roof, gave the conductor a dime rather than looking at my pocketbook. You don't know how lofty and superior I felt. The Throg in State Street was dirt beneath my queenly feet that scorned to know what they were treading on. When I crossed Madison Street, I heard people yelling around me, and then, in a moment, a policeman had pulled me from under a grip car. I haven't tried it since, but have gone back to Chicago style, hurrying and dodging and getting strabismus trying to look 6 ways at once, and winking a cinder out of my eye at the same time. Gibson's girls may do for the Acropolis at Athens, where the marble gods won't run over them, but they won't do for Chicago. Having lived in Chicago for almost 5 years, I can attest to that. Here's the complicated part of the Gibson girl. There are many good aspects to her, but also many that are not so good. But let's start with the good. At the time she emerged in the 1890s, late Victorian society was grappling with the simultaneous rise of the new woman, a new type of way to be a woman that leaned into feminist movements and shirked the social ideals of past decades. Women sought better education, got into sports, wanted to partake in politics, and enter the workforce. This obviously encouraged a new rise in collective confidence in the face of demands by their male peers. The Gibson girl exemplified this shift in every possible way. Lindy Gordon describes the Gibson girl as tall, long-legged, and graceful, with upswept hair, faintly pink cheeks, a provocative eye, and a cool, detached air. And Adrian Bailey adds, she was determinedly self-assured, part college girl, part fashionable beauty. She was not just exceptionally pretty, she could look you straight in the eye, had a firm handshake. Gibson girls had places to go, people to see, men to reject. No longer were they confined to the home or only aspiring to mother and wifehood. Everyone wanted to be her, everyone wanted her. You can see in this era an interesting shift in the way that women took photos of themselves too, especially college girls, or the way that women were portrayed in art, like, for example, this painting of Mr. and Mrs. I.N. Phelps Stokes, painted by future friend of the channel John Singer Sargent, in which Mrs. Stokes is deliberately painted overshadowing her husband, smiling and posing proudly in a very Gibson-esque outfit. She is visibly a woman who is out in public, taking part in the world with her own pursuits. Shirtwaists, which were a quintessential part of the classic Gibson Girl style, nearly doubled in popularity in the 1890s, signifying an important shift in women becoming more active. Because of their enormous popularity and how easy it was to mass produce them, it increasingly became more and more accessible for non-wealthy women to grasp at that Gibson Girl style. It's important to understand that this was a time period where your fashion could define everything. It was integral to getting a good job and seen as the prime way to advance feminist goals. Gibson girls were shown smoking, doing sports, or even serving on juries, though Gibson did not support women's suffrage, though. And the drawings of her did a great deal of legwork in normalizing the idea of women seeking a higher education. The early years of women breaking into the college scene were catastrophic. College women were blamed for basically any number of social problems that could be thrown at them. Falling birth rates, lower marriage rates, rising number of divorces, general health issues, the list goes on. Many white writers fearfully complained that college women were committing race suicide. In a very material way, Gibson's drawings encourage people to think of women's education in a new light, regardless of if it was realistic or not. Elena Jennifer Manzer writes, "The first generation of women pursuing higher education, roughly between 1865 to 1890, was categorized as masculine in appearance. These graduates challenged the traditional roles of domesticity and were perceived as unflattering women, both in personality and appearance. The creation of the Gibson Girl reshaped the perspective of college girls as being physically attractive." Let's switch up the glasses here, shall we? Yes, very nice. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that the Gibson girls were perfect, because try as they might, Gibson himself made it evident that being a Gibson girl was a slim demographic. For one very obvious thing, she was always slim, wealthy, and white. Of course, women of color were active participants in adopting the Gibson Girl style. We have loads of beautiful photos showing this, but the fact that Gibson's art was so pervasive and popular and nearly all-encompassing, and deliberately excluded women of color and women of larger body types unless to make some sort of very specific point, effectively further disenfranchised those women in a world where attaining the fashion ideal was integral to social mobility and economic stability in many ways. As the popular American feminine beauty ideal funneled down into one look being created by one man, popularized greater than ever before by mass media, it became ever more difficult for women outside of that standard to be seen as adequate. People of all demographics could do little more than pick and choose parts of her that were attainable. Her style and personality, yes, but her slimness, height, face, and white skin were not things you could order out of the Sears catalog. Unfortunately, I have to be the bearer of bad news in that yes, this was not just a misstep on Charles Dana Gibson's part. It was a deliberate choice. He literally said so himself. I am quoting Gibson right now, so if you're one of those people who listens to my videos without looking at the screen, please note, this is a quote from Charles Dana Gibson. "The best part of her beauty has come from the nation of our origin, Great Britain. In England are today the most beautiful of European women. That does not seem to be quite understood. English women are credited with being stronger than their sisters of the continent, but really they are better looking too. Nowhere in the world except in the United States is there such a grace of carriage among men and women, such fine coloring, such generally good facial features." End quote. Okay. He went on to say a number of racist things later in that article that I imagine he probably thought sounded pretty feminist in general, but just made him sound incredibly stupid. At the end of the day, despite his claim that he pulled the Gibson Girl from the crowd, Gibson was completely obsessed with only one type of woman, and that woman was white, British American, and probably looked like his wife. He tried very hard to rationalize this with weird non-logic about how these women are prettier because American men respect them more, which... No. Gibson, it seems, was very, very interested in a weird, racist sort of Darwinism, talking at length about evolution and the savages of history. Not at all surprising, to be completely honest. Gibson was proud of the fact that he could trace his ancestry back to the first English settlers on American soil, and was deeply invested in British high society. He tried to claim that his Gibson Girl was all the best facets of all the world's races, and that he was proud of America's melting pot society, but in the end, those claims end up twisting in on themselves when confronted with the work itself. Jennifer Greenhill explains, "By not standing out racially or ethnically, immigrants could more readily assimilate into American society. Progressives like Theodore Roosevelt deployed this rhetoric to demonstrate American system's benevolence. But this paternalism also, of course, masked the violent realities of imperialism and the anxious desire to maintain Anglo-American political and social supremacy at home." Gibson's notion that the American girl of the future would combine the best points of the races but look essentially white fits with this rhetoric. His statement has the ring of tolerance but cannot help but be informed by the period's racist paternalism. As much as Gibson wanted people to believe that his girl came from everywhere, it's clearly just not true. She had a very distinctive, singular look, emphasized by the fact that, well, yeah, he had literal models for his drawings. There were real-life Gibson girls. Let's go meet them. Earlier this month, we discussed one of the original Gibson Girl models, Evelyn Nesbit, and how her life was riddled with tragedy and scandal as she was caught up in the schemes and jealousy of two of the richest men in New York City, leading to a famous murder. So please do go check out that video to learn more about Evelyn, who was the model for Gibson's The Eternal Question illustration for Collier's. Other than Evelyn, though, there were a large number of women who posed for Gibson, namely his wife Irene, but there were few others who earned great fame due to their role as Gibson girls. The most famous at the time was a woman named Camille Clifford. You actually may have seen her before because her photos are very, very commonly spread around as, like, scandalous examples of Edwardian tight-lacing. I mean, yeah, obviously. Who the hell could possibly have a body like this? Well, even Camille Clifford didn't have a body like this. Karolina Zabrowska and Bernadette Banner have both made very informative videos on this a while ago, so definitely check those out to learn more. But Camille's photos are a perfect example of what you could call early Photoshop, which, in fact, was super common. It was actually very easy for early photographers to seamlessly manipulate their photos to beautify the subjects or add in other elements, something that I touched on in my video on the Cottingley Ferry photos. Camille Clifford looked like this through a combination of corsetry, padding, and paint. Many of these photos had her waist painted in to make her figure look more dramatic. Camille Clifford was born in Belgium in 1885 and became a popular actress in America and London due to her beauty and figure. While living in the US, Clifford won a magazine contest that called for the lady who should be the most representative New York girl according to the famous Dana Gibson pattern. Her reward was $2,000, and she earned a role in the production of The Prince of Pilsen in 1904 as, literally, the Gibson Girl. Reviews on her performances were mixed. One review in the Times said, "The voice of Camille Clifford is not strong, but she wears such beautifully cut clothes and moves so elegantly up and down the stage that her turn is sure to be popular. Her beauty caught the eye of Captain Henry Lyndhurst Bruce, and they were married not long after. During her time in the play The Belle of Mayfair, she even had her own solo, a song titled, 'Why Do They Call Me a Gibson Girl?' Though Clifford wasn't one of Gibson's actual models, she is important because she clearly represents a person who succeeded in completely embodying the Gibson Girl ideal without being the original." Martha H. Patterson writes, "Gibson Girl's status required a contractual obligation. Only by performing the identity the Gibson Girl image implied could one reap the rewards her image promised." And that's what Clifford did. She embodied the beauty ideal to the point where she became known as the Gibson Girl, and she married a handsome and wealthy Gibson man. It's a success story that was not to be repeated by her Gibson Girl contemporaries, who actually posed for the artist himself, particularly another actress named Mabel Normand. So, my original intention was to have a whole section here covering Mabel Normand and her scandals, but much like the Evelyn Nesbit case, there were so many interesting details that I didn't want to leave out that I just kept writing and writing and writing and writing and writing and writing and writing. And I got like halfway through, and then my chronic illnesses were like, you need to stop. My health is in shambles. I'm working on it though, don't worry. Oh, Jesus. So I'm out here photosynthesizing my stupid physical form for my stupid mental health. And hoping my physical health follows suit. So yeah, anyway, that'll need to be its own video, I guess, eventually. I'm sorry, I feel really bad. That video will cover the fact that Mabel Normand was one of Gibson's favorite models, and then she became a famous silent film comedian and was frequently paired with the actor Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, who ended up being involved in a horrible murder trial, and then Mabel was romantically involved with bisexual movie director William Desmond Taylor, who then got murdered. It's wild. But yeah, both of these scandals effectively ruined Mabel's career, and she tragically died in 1930 at the age of 38 of tuberculosis. It's hard to say if there's a reason why so many Gibson girls had such tragic lives. I mean, I don't know if there really is one. Maybe in the end, Camille Clifford was the only one who actually really got to hold that fantasy in her hands until the end of her life. Yeah. Oh. It's kind of cold out here though. As all things do, the Gibson Girl eventually fell out of fashion and was replaced with the flapper and so on. The new woman was replaced with newer and even newer women. But still, the Gibson Girl style would go on to experience a number of popular revivals. In the post-World War II era, particularly in 1947 to 48 and then 1951 to 52, a return to emphasis on traditional femininity had people yearning for their mothers' and grandmothers' styles, with all of the social progressivism it was associated with back then scrubbed off of it. And so, the full skirt and snatched waist and sloped shoulders of the Gibson Girl returned. But, divorced from the socio-political aspect of the new woman, these Gibson Girl revivals ended up being largely just commodified and materialistic. The term Gibson Girl was used as mostly a marketing buzzword, especially for blouses, and Gibson's illustrations were reprinted on fabrics as patterns, especially later in the 70s. The 50s also saw Hollywood's new fixation on all things Edwardian, as movie musicals dominated the film market, featuring popular stories set in the turn of the century, which in turn led to even more interest in any fashion marketed with the term Gibson Girl in the name. It's important to note the power of art here. Artistic representation of the human form is a remarkably direct way to get inside people's heads and hearts in a way that the written word could never do. It's part of the reason why, noting the influence of the Gibson Girl, suffragettes in the 1910s turned to illustration to promote their cause. During World War I, propaganda posters challenged women's image of themselves and shifted it once again, encouraging women to join the war effort and take on roles that they had never had before. Once again, these illustrations connected to people's aspirational instinct, portraying these wartime working women as an almost new sort of Gibson Girl, useful but still traditionally beautiful and overwhelmingly white. Nevertheless, it succeeded in permanently removing womanhood from a static position in the home. The right to vote, for most white women at least, came not long after. The years between 1870 and 1920 saw a 63% increase in women employed outside of the domestic sphere, and the influence of magazine images showing women in the workplace, to a mild extent, had a big part in that gradual shift. Though Gibson's illustrations were never heavy-handed in revolutionizing the public role of women, it has to be acknowledged that if he had been, his drawings never would have gained the fame and influence that they did. It would have been too shocking, and many artists in the same era crashed and burned for exactly that reason. So Gibson's progressivism, what little there actually was, ended up being as subtle as possible, slowly acclimating the public to certain ideas. How does that saying go again? If you turn the heat up slowly enough, the frog in the pot won't notice that it's being boiled. You get the idea. But Gibson's progressivism was often misdirected, too. For instance, the subject of marriage was a huge passion of his, but He often took out his frustrations at social expectations on women, the ones with the littlest power in the situation, portraying them often in a reversed role from the one they actually have. His grandson, Langhorne Gibson Jr., explains, venting his ire at the exquisite women he drew who married old and unattractive men for money, he seemed to enjoy their unhappiness as they sat alone at massive dining room tables or collapsed over piano keyboards, pining for children and young virile husbands forever out of their reach. In particular, Dana, an ardent American, railed against the quite common practice of wealthy Americans marrying off their daughter to European peers for the privilege of a title. His central character in these drawings, his American girl, for all her beauty and gracefulness, was more often than not a grasping, willful, and obviously shallow creature for whom he accorded little passion. He clearly understood that many of these social conundrums were bad, but could never quite figure out exactly why, because his own internalized misogyny was standing in the way. But as usual, Gibson's work is never one side or the other. His grandson also remembered one extremely memorable thing that Gibson once said, which, if heard by most men of the time, would have gotten him laughed out of the room. "I don't think husbands should allow their wives to have their own way. I think they should insist on it." So what's the moral here? Is there one in the first place? It's hard to say. Much like today's aesthetic girls, the Gibson Girl was by no means an all-encompassing representation of her era, especially outside of the US. Though many surely aspired to be her, she was an unattainable goal for those without the money or time to dedicate to being her. And yet, as we look back on the Edwardian era, the Gibson Girl is what we imagine, and due to her influence, she is much of what we see. In the end, the Gibson Girl escaped her paper confines and became the icon of all Edwardian women, many years after she ceased to be fashionable or even socially revolutionary. We can see similar things happen to the aesthetic girls of today. A new stylistic lifestyle crops up, and then it becomes twisted in on itself and its own implications. It ceases to feel new and exciting, and then people move on to a different look. The cycle becomes shorter and shorter every year. It's too soon to tell if any of our last decade's looks will have the historical lasting power that the Gibson Girl did. Maybe they died too soon. But regardless, the Gibson Girl is memorable for a reason, and as a result, she continues to be resurrected in her own way over each generation. It's the kind of immortality that most artists can only ever dream of. Thank you for learning with me about the Gibson Girls and some pretty awful, murders. I hope you enjoyed it, and please let me know in the comments if you were as into the Gibson Girl as a kid as I was. And don't forget to head to the links in the description below to get yourself some fun new glasses from glassesusa.com. Anyway, until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and remember, not all things come naturally. Sometimes you just need a bit of padding and the right attitude.